I was offered $5 million to bury a truth that would kill thousands, but as I reached for the pen, a warning from the grave revealed a terrifying secret. I thought I was saving my daughter's life, but I didn't realize I was signing a deal with the man who had already murdered my father 30 years ago. The rain didn't just fall in Seattle, it leaned against you. A cold, heavy weight that seeped into your bones and stayed there. I sat in the back of a black town car, watching the neon lights of the city blur into long, bleeding streaks of crimson and amber against the glass. In my lap sat a leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was a document that would change everything, not just for me, but for 3,000 people living in the shadow of the Blackwood Dam. For 15 years, I had been the man people called when they wanted the truth. As a senior structural auditor, my reputation was my only currency. I was the Iron Pillar. I didn't take bribes, I didn't overlook minor clerical errors, and I didn't blink when billionaires tried to stare me down. My principles were the cage I lived in, a sturdy, honest, and increasingly lonely cage. But principles don't pay for a specialized pediatric wing in Zurich. They don't cover the cost of a surgery that could give a 7-year-old girl the ability to walk again. My daughter, Clara, was the only thing I loved more than my integrity, and for the last 6 months, those two loves had been at war. The car pulled up to the curb of a glass and steel monolith, the headquarters of Sterling Vane Development. The man waiting for me inside was Julian Vane. He was the kind of man who wore $3,000 suits and talked about the greater good while stepping on the necks of anyone who stood in his way. He needed me to sign off on the Blackwood audit. The dam was crumbling. Not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but soon. My report detailed the systemic failure of the concrete. Vane wanted that report to disappear. In exchange, he was offering a consulting fee of $5 million. It was enough to save Clara. It was enough to buy my soul 5 times over. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent. I watched the floor numbers climb, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I felt like a man walking to his own execution, except I was the one holding the rope. The doors slid open to a room that smelled of expensive scotch and old money. Julian Vane was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, a crystal glass in his hand. He didn't turn around when I entered. "You're late, Elias," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was starting to think you'd developed a conscience at the last minute." "The traffic was bad," I lied. My voice sounded hollow, even to me. Vane turned, a thin, predatory smile stretching across his face. He gestured to the mahogany desk where a single sheet of paper waited. It was a non-disclosure agreement coupled with a resignation letter. Once I signed, the Blackwood report would be buried in his private archives, and the money would be wired to an offshore account in the Caymans within the hour. "Think of it this way," Vane said, walking toward me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be fatherly but felt like a brand. "The dam might hold for another 20 years. By then, we'll have reinforced it through other, more quiet channels. You aren't hurting anyone, you're just saving your daughter. Is a stack of concrete worth more than her future?" He was good. He knew exactly where to twist the knife. I looked at the pen sitting on the desk. It was a heavy, silver fountain pen. It looked like a weapon. "I need to see the transfer initiated first," I said. My throat felt like it was full of dry sand. Vane chuckled. "Always the pragmatist." "Very well." He tapped a few keys on his laptop. "There, the escrow is ready. 1 stroke of that pen, Elias, and you never have to worry about a medical bill again. You can take Clara to Switzerland. You can be the hero she thinks you are." I walked to the desk. The city lights below looked like fallen stars. I thought about Clara's face, her small hand clutching mine in the hospital room, her voice asking when she'd be able to run in the park again. I thought about the 3,000 people living downstream from the Blackwood Dam, families, children, people just like me, sleeping soundly, unaware that their lives were being traded for a signature. I picked up the pen. The silver was cold against my skin. I lowered the nib to the paper, the ink blooming like a dark bruise on the white surface. I just had to write my name, Elias Vance, 7 letters to end the nightmare, 7 letters to become a monster. I started the first curve of the E. My hand was shaking, but I forced it down. I was doing this for her. I had to believe that. But then, the air in the room seemed to thin. A sudden, sharp scent of ozone and wet earth filled my nostrils, the smell of the mountains back home in West Virginia. It was out of place in this sterile, high-rise office. I felt a sudden, violent chill crawl up my spine, the kind of cold that doesn't come from the weather. I looked up, expecting to see Vane, but he was gone. Or rather, he was still there, but he was blurred, like a figure seen through a rain-streaked window. The room began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that rattled my teeth. "Elias!" Vane's voice sounded miles away, distorted. "What are you waiting for? Sign it." I tried to focus on the paper, but the mahogany desk was fading. In its place, a rough-hewn wooden table appeared. The smell of wood smoke replaced the scotch. I blinked, my breath hitching in my chest. I wasn't in a penthouse anymore. I was in a small, cramped kitchen. The walls were covered in peeling floral wallpaper. Through the window, I didn't see the Seattle skyline. I saw the dark, looming silhouette of the Appalachian Mountains. A shadow moved in the corner of my eye. I turned my head slowly, my heart stopping in my chest. Sitting across from me wasn't Julian Vane. It was a man I hadn't seen in 25 years. He was wearing a faded denim work shirt, his hands scarred and stained with coal dust. His eyes, the same piercing blue as mine, were fixed on me with a look of profound, quiet disappointment. "Dad?" I whispered, the word catching in my throat. My father had died in a mine collapse when I was 18. He had died because a foreman had taken a bribe to ignore a safety violation. He had died for the very thing I was about to do. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and placed a small, rusted object on the table between us. It was an old brass compass, the casing dented, the needle spinning aimlessly. He looked from the compass to the pen in my hand, then back to my eyes. The vision flickered. The penthouse rushed back in, the glass, the steel, the smell of Vane's expensive cologne. But the cold stayed, and so did the image of my father's face. "Elias?" Vane was leaning over me now, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I looked down at the paper. The E was half finished. My hand was no longer shaking. It was frozen. I looked at the window, expecting to see my reflection, but I didn't see the man I had become, the tired, broken auditor in a cheap suit. I saw someone else standing behind me in the reflection of the glass. It wasn't my father. It was a younger version of myself, the boy who had stood at his father's funeral and sworn that he would never, ever let a life be sold for a profit. And that boy was pointing at something outside the window, something far below in the dark streets. I followed his finger, looking down past the lights of the city. There, standing on the sidewalk 60 stories below, bathed in the glow of a single street lamp, was a figure that shouldn't have been there. It was Clara, but she wasn't in her wheelchair. She was standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on mine, and she was holding a sign that I could read as clearly as if it were an inch from my face. The words on the sign made the pen fall from my nerveless fingers. The words on the sign were simple, written in the jagged, uneven scrawl of a child learning to master a pencil. "The water is rising." I stared down at the street, my lungs suddenly feeling as though they were filled with the very liquid I feared. Clara looked up, her face a pale moon in the darkness. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stood there, a silent sentinel in the rain, holding a warning that shouldn't have been possible. "Elias!" Vane's voice cracked through the vision like a gunshot. I jerked my head back toward him. The mahogany desk was solid again. The smell of wood smoke had vanished, replaced by the sterile ozone scent of the air conditioning. Vane was staring at me, his eyes narrowing into slits of suspicion. "You've been staring into space for 30 seconds, Vane said, his voice losing its artificial warmth. "The pen is in your hand. The money is a keystroke away. What is the problem?" I looked back at the window. The street lamp was still there, flickering in the Seattle drizzle, but the sidewalk was empty. No Clara, no sign, just the cold, wet pavement and the distant, rhythmic pulse of a city that didn't know it was in danger. I need a moment," I stammered, leaning against the desk. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my ribcage. "Time is a luxury we don't have," Vane said, walking around the desk. He stood too close, invading my personal space with the confidence of a predator. "The board meeting is at 8 a.m. tomorrow. I need that audit revised and filed by midnight. If your name isn't on that paper, the escrow closes, and I find someone else who understands the value of family." I looked at the silver pen. The water is rising. The phrase echoed in my mind, layered over the memory of my father's disappointed eyes. Was I hallucinating? Was the stress of Clara's illness finally snapping the strings of my sanity? Or was there something else, something deeper, trying to pull me back from the edge of the abyss? "Why the rush, Julian?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "The dam has been there for 50 years. Another week won't make a difference in the structural integrity." Vane stiffened. He turned away, walking back to the window. "Development is about momentum, Elias. We have investors. We have timelines. You have a plan for the valley," I interrupted, my eyes drifting to a stack of architectural renders on a side table that I hadn't noticed before. They weren't for the dam. I walked over and flipped the top sheet. My stomach turned. The renders showed a sprawling luxury resort, complete with a golf course, high-end shopping, and a marina. The location was unmistakably the Blackwood Valley. But there was one glaring problem. The entire development was built exactly where the town of Blackwood currently stood. This is the flood zone," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "If the dam fails, the town is wiped out. It's at the lowest point of the basin." Vane didn't turn around. He stayed silhouetted against the city lights. "The town is a relic, Elias. Failing infrastructure, dying economy. It's a drain on the state's resources. But an accidental breach? That's an act of God. It triggers insurance payouts that would take a decade to litigate otherwise. It clears the land. It allows for rebirth." The air in the room suddenly felt freezing. "You don't want me to hide the flaws so you can fix them," I said, the horror dawning on me. "You want me to hide them so that when it breaks, nobody can claim you knew it was coming. You're not just risking those people. You're counting on their destruction." Vane turned, and for the first time, I saw the true mask fall away. There was no charm left, only a cold, calculating void. People die every day, Elias. They die of old age, they die of disease, they die of bad luck. But 3,000 people losing their homes so that 10,000 can have jobs? That's math. That's progress. He stepped toward me, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "And let's not forget the one person who matters most to you. Clara doesn't have time for your morality. She needs that surgery. If you walk out of here without signing, you aren't just a man of principle. You're the man who let his daughter spend the rest of her life in a chair because he was too proud to look the other way." He was right. That was the sickening part. Every word he said was a jagged truth designed to tear me apart. I looked at the pen, then at the renders of his rebirth. I saw the faces of the people I had interviewed at the dam, the shopkeeper who'd given me a free coffee, the school teacher who'd asked if the rumors of the cracks were true. I felt the weight of the silver pen again. It felt heavier now, like it was made of lead. I thought of the vision of my father. Tell the truth. "I can't do it," I said, the words barely a whisper. I dropped the pen. It clattered against the mahogany, the sound echoing like a gavel. "I'm going to the press. I'm going to the state authorities. I'll find the money for Clara another way." Vane didn't look surprised. He didn't even look angry. He just sighed, a weary, patronizing sound. "I was afraid you'd say that," he said, reaching into his suit jacket. "I expected a gun. I expected a threat." Instead, he pulled out a cell phone and turned the screen toward me. It was a live video feed. It showed a hospital room, Clara's room. She was asleep, her small chest rising and falling beneath the thin white blanket. But she wasn't alone. 2 men in dark suits were standing by the door. One of them was holding a small black device, a portable ventilator override. "My people are already at the hospital, Elias," Vane said softly. "I didn't want it to come to this, truly, but I've invested too much in Blackwood to let one auditor's conscience ruin me." My breath hitched. You wouldn't. She's a child. She's leverage," Vane corrected. "And right now, she's the only thing keeping you from making a very loud, very public mistake." I felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal urge to leap across the desk and wrap my hands around his throat. But before I could move, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with trembling hands. It wasn't a call from the hospital. It was a text message from an unknown number. I opened it, expecting a ransom note. Instead, it was an image, a photograph of a document from 30 years ago. It was a safety inspection report for the mine where my father died. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page to see the signature of the inspector who had cleared the mine for operation. The name at the bottom of the page wasn't some stranger. It was a name I recognized instantly, a name that connected my father's death directly to the man standing in front of me. But as I stared at the screen, the image began to distort. The text started to move, the letters swirling and reforming into a new message that had nothing to do with the past. "Look at the lights," the screen read. I looked up at the window and my blood turned to ice. The city lights of Seattle were no longer amber and red. They were gone. In their place, a wall of churning black water was rushing toward the glass, 60 stories up, a tidal wave that reached the sky. And as the water slammed into the building, the entire penthouse groaned, the glass beginning to spiderweb with 1,000 tiny cracks. "Elias?" Vane's voice was suddenly full of genuine terror. "What's happening? Why is the floor moving?" I looked at him, then back at the window. The water wasn't outside. It was inside. It was pouring through the cracks in the glass, freezing and relentless. But as the first wave hit my feet, I realized something even more terrifying. I wasn't feeling the water. I was feeling the pressure. I looked down at my hands. They were translucent. I could see the mahogany desk through my own skin. "Julian," I whispered, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "We aren't in your office." The floor beneath us gave way, and as we fell into the darkness, a single booming sound echoed through the void, the sound of a concrete dam finally catastrophically bursting open. The roar of the water faded into the low, mechanical hum of the HVAC system, but the cold stayed. I was gasping for air, my fingers clawing at the edge of the mahogany desk. My hands weren't translucent anymore, but they were shaking so violently I had to tuck them into my lap. Vane was staring at me, his face a mask of calculated concern. "Elias, you went pale. I think the pressure is getting to you. Just sign the document and we can end this. You can go to the hospital. You can be with Clara." I looked at the phone screen he was still holding. The live feed of Clara's hospital room was steady. The 2 men were still there, shadows in the corner of the frame. One of them checked his watch. They were waiting for a signal. I looked down at my own phone, the one that had shown me the mine report. The screen was black now, but the image was burned into my retinas. The signature on that 30-year-old report, the one that had sent my father to his grave, wasn't Julian Vane's. It was his father's, Arthur Vane. But the witness signature, the junior executive who had notarized the bribe, was Julian. He hadn't just inherited this empire of blood, he had helped build its foundation. "The mine in Logan County," I whispered. My voice was a rasp, a ghost of itself. Vane froze, The predatory smile didn't leave his face, but it hardened, turning into something brittle and dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about. We're discussing the Blackwood Dam, Elias. Focus." 1994, I said, gaining strength as the vision of my father's face returned to me. This time, he wasn't disappointed. He was expectant. The Blue Creek mine collapse. 12 men died because the structural supports were downgraded to save $40,000 in timber costs. You notarized that safety waiver, Julian. You were 23 years old. You knew then, and you know now. Vane set the phone down on the desk, screen up so I could still see Clara. History is a graveyard, Elias. Everyone has skeletons, but only one of us has a daughter whose life depends on the next 5 minutes. Do you really want to litigate the past while your future is on the line? The room seemed to shift again. The scent of wood smoke and wet earth returned, stronger than before. I felt a weight in my pocket, something heavy and metallic. I reached in and pulled it out. It was the brass compass, my father's compass. I hadn't brought it with me. I hadn't seen it in years. It had been lost in the fire that claimed my mother's house a decade ago. Yet, here it was, the dented casing cold against my palm. I popped the latch. The needle didn't point north. It spun wildly, a frantic silver blur, before snapping violently toward the window, toward the Blackwood Valley miles away. "How did you get that?" Vane asked, his voice cracking. He saw the compass. He recognized it. "I didn't," I said. "He did." I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor like a scream. The fear that had been paralyzing me was still there, but it was being overtaken by something else. A righteous, burning fury that tasted like coal dust and mountain rain. "You think you're the only one who can play with lives, Julian? You think I'm just an auditor?" I stepped toward him, the compass held out like a shield. "I've spent 15 years looking at the bones of this country. I know where the cracks are, not just in the concrete, but in the books, in the ledgers, in the offshore accounts you use to pay those men in my daughter's room." Vane laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You have nothing. No proof, no leverage. Even if you found that old report, it's past the statute of limitations. But murder? Murder is very much in the present. If I press this button, your daughter's ventilator stops. The backup generator won't kick in because, as you so eloquently pointed out, I know where the clerical errors are in the hospital's maintenance records." He picked up the phone, his thumb hovering over a red icon. "Sign it, Elias. Now. Or she dies." I looked at Clara's sleeping face on the screen. My heart felt like it was being crushed in a vice. My principles were a heavy burden, but Clara was my soul. How could I choose? How could I let the man who killed my father kill my daughter too? But the compass needle was still pointing toward the window. It wasn't just pointing, it was vibrating, the metal humming with a frequency that made the glass of the penthouse windows rattle, and then I heard it. It wasn't a vision this time, it wasn't a memory. It was a sound coming from the television mounted on the far wall, which was muted but flashing with a breaking news alert. Vane saw it too. He turned, his thumb still hovering over the button. The headline across the bottom of the screen read, "Emergency evacuation ordered for Blackwood Valley. Seismic anomaly detected." "What?" Vane whispered. "No, it's too early. The pressure shouldn't have reached critical for months." "It's not the pressure, Julian," I said, realization dawning on me. I looked at the compass in my hand. The needle had stopped spinning. It was pointing directly at Vane. "It's the foundation. You built your empire on a lie, and the earth has a long memory." The building suddenly lurched. A deep, tectonic groan rose from the bowels of the skyscraper. This wasn't a vision of water. It was an earthquake, or something worse. Vane stumbled, dropping the phone. It slid across the floor toward me. I lunged for it, my fingers brushing the glass, but the floor tilted again, sending the mahogany desk sliding toward the window. "The hospital!" I screamed, grabbing the phone. The feed was still live. The two men in the room were looking around in confusion as the hospital walls began to shake. One of them looked at the camera, at me, and raised the override device. "No," I yelled. But before he could press the button, the door to Clara's room burst open. A figure stepped inside. He was tall, shadowed, and wearing a faded denim work shirt. He moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a man of his age, his hands, scarred and stained with coal dust, reaching for the man with the device. Vane scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in rage. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at me, and he reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a compact black revolver. "I don't care about the dam anymore," Vane hissed, the barrel of the gun leveled at my chest. "If I'm going down, I'm taking everything you love with me." He pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was swallowed by a deafening roar as the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse finally shattered, not from water, but from the sheer force of the air pressure as the building began to tilt into the street. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my side, but I didn't fall. I watched, horrified, as Vane was sucked toward the broken window by the rushing wind. He clawed at the carpet, his eyes wide with the realization that all his money and all his power couldn't stop gravity. I looked down at the phone in my hand, desperate to see if Clara was safe. The screen was flickering, the connection dying. The last thing I saw before the image cut to static was the man in the denim shirt standing over the two unconscious guards. He turned toward the camera, and for a split second the static cleared. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at someone standing just behind me. I turned around, the wind howling through the office, and saw my father standing in the center of the room, untouched by the chaos. He wasn't a ghost. He was solid, real, and he was holding a hand out to me. But as I reached for him, the floor beneath me vanished entirely. I was falling into the dark, the Seattle skyline spinning above me like a carousel of dying stars. I waited for the impact, for the end, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt a hand catch mine, a grip of iron and coal. I looked up, expecting to see my father, but the face looking back at me was much younger, and the eyes weren't blue. They were dark, hooded, and filled with a terrifying, ancient recognition. "Not yet, Elias," the man said, his voice vibrating in my very marrow. "The debt isn't settled." He let go. I hit the water, but it wasn't the cold Puget Sound. It was thick, black, and tasted of sulfur. When I broke the surface, gasping and spitting, I wasn't in Seattle. I was standing in the middle of a flooded street, the dark mountains of West Virginia looming over me, and then I heard the scream. It wasn't Clara. It was a woman's voice coming from a house that was being swept away by the current. I looked at my hands. They were covered in coal dust. I wasn't the auditor anymore. I was 18 years old, and the date was May 14th, 1994, the day the mine collapsed. The sulfurous air of the Blue Creek mine was a physical weight, pressing against my lungs just as the Seattle rain had moments before. I looked down at my hands, calloused, grime-streaked, and young. I was 18. My father, Arthur, stood 10 feet away, adjusting his headlamp. He looked exactly as I remembered him, yet the clarity was agonizing. This wasn't a hazy memory, this was the present. "Elias, stop daydreaming," my father said, his voice a low rumble. "We've got a double shift if we want to make rent this month. Move it." I stood frozen. I knew what was about to happen. In 20 minutes, the support beams in Sector 4 would groan. In 25, the ceiling would come down, burying 12 men, including the man standing in front of me, because a greedy executive had signed a waiver saying the timber was sound when it was actually rotting. "Dad, don't go down," I said, my voice cracking. He paused, looking at me with those piercing blue eyes. "What's gotten into you? We've got work to do." "The supports in Sector 4 are failing," I blurted out. "The veins, they lied about the inspection. There's a waiver in the mine office right now. Julian Vane notarized it. If you go down there, you don't come back." My father narrowed his eyes. He didn't ask how I knew. In the mountains, we lived on intuition as much as coal. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in my eyes, the terror of a man who had already lived through this grief once. "Stay here," he commanded. He didn't go to the elevator. He walked straight to the foreman's shack. I followed him, my heart hammering. Inside, a young, impeccably dressed man was sitting at a scarred wooden desk, looking wildly out of place in the dust-choked office. It was Julian Vane, 23 years old, his face already etched with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. "Vance," young Julian said, looking up, "why aren't you at the face?" My father didn't speak. He reached across the desk and grabbed the stack of papers Julian had been trying to slide into a drawer. Julian lunged for them, but my father was a man made of iron and coal. He shoved Julian back and flipped through the pages until he found it. The safety waiver. "You signed off on this," my father hissed. "These beams are salvaged scrap. You're sending men into a tomb." "It's a temporary measure," Julian stammered, his eyes darting to me. "The new timber is on back order. We're losing money every hour the mine is idle." "You're trading lives for hours," I said, stepping forward. I felt the weight of my future self, the auditor, the man of principles, merging with the boy I used to be. And you're going to spend the rest of your life paying for it. At that moment, a low, distant thud echoed through the ground. The mine breathed a sigh of dust. The collapse had started. "No!" my father roared, grabbing the emergency radio. He began shouting orders, telling the men to evacuate, his voice a beacon in the chaos. Julian Vane tried to bolt for the door, but I caught him. I held him there, forcing him to listen to the sounds of the mountain screaming. I wanted him to feel the fear he had so casually inflicted on others. "Look at them," I whispered in his ear as the miners began to scramble out of the shaft, coughing and covered in gray silt. "Every one of those men is a life you didn't get to take." The vision began to blur. The wooden walls of the shack turned to glass. The smell of coal dust turned back into the scent of Julian Vane's expensive cologne. I blinked, and I was back in the penthouse. The gunshot I had heard at the end of the fall hadn't happened yet. Or maybe it had, and time had looped back to the moment of decision. Julian Vane was standing in front of me, the black revolver leveled at my chest, his thumb on the trigger. But he was shaking. The news report on the TV was still flashing. "Emergency evacuation, Blackwood Dam." "Sign it!" Vane screamed, his voice cracking with the same desperation I had seen in the mine office 30 years ago. "Sign it, and I'll stop them. I'll save your daughter." I looked at him, and for the first time in 6 months I wasn't afraid. I wasn't the man who could be bought, and I wasn't the man who could be bullied. "My father didn't die that day, Julian," I said softly. Vane's eyes widened. "What are you talking about? He died in the Blue Creek collapse." "No," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face as the memories of the new past flooded in. "He didn't. Because someone stopped him. Someone showed him the truth." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It wasn't showing the hospital room anymore. It was showing a digital archive. Because I had changed the past, the paper trail hadn't been buried. It had been litigated. The Vane family hadn't built an empire. They had built a legacy of lawsuits and disgrace. The penthouse around us began to dissolve. The mahogany desk turned to cheap laminate. The view of the Seattle skyline flickered and died, replaced by the interior of a modest, cluttered office in a public works building. I wasn't a high-priced auditor in a tailored suit. I was a state inspector in a wrinkled shirt. "Elias?" I turned. Standing in the doorway was a woman with gray hair and a warm smile. My mother. She was alive. "The surgery went well," she said, her voice thick with relief. "Clara is awake. She's asking for you." I looked down at the desk. There was no bribe. There was no non-disclosure agreement. There was only a report, signed by me, detailing the repairs already completed on the Blackwood Dam, repairs paid for by the settlement funds from the Vane family's bankruptcy decades ago. I stood up, my legs feeling solid and strong. I walked to the window. Outside, the Blackwood Valley was green and lush. The town was there, safe and dry in the afternoon sun. I looked at the brass compass sitting on my desk. The needle was steady, pointing true north. I hadn't just saved my daughter. I had saved my soul by refusing to let the past repeat itself. The vision hadn't been a hallucination. It had been a correction. As I walked out of the office to go to the hospital, I passed a janitor buffing the floors. He was an older man, stooped and gray, his face lined with the bitterness of a life spent in the shadows. He looked up as I passed, and for a second our eyes met. It was Julian Vane. He didn't recognize me. In this world, we were strangers. He went back to his work, scrubbing the floors of a building he once thought he would own. I stepped out into the air, and for the first time in my life, the rain didn't feel heavy. It felt like a baptism. I had lost the millions, the penthouse, and the prestige. But as I drove toward the hospital to see my daughter walk for the first time, I knew I was the richest man in the world. The debt was finally settled.